In the last few minutes, we've learned that Theresa May has written to the European Council President, Donald Tusk, asking for a further extension to Brexit. This is a copy of the letter. In it, she requests that the UK should be given until the 30th of June to ratify a deal. I'm just going to pick out a couple of lines from it for you. She writes, "This impasse cannot be allowed to continue. In the UK, it's creating uncertainty and doing damage to faith in politics, while the European Union has a legitimate desire to move on to decisions about its own future." She says, "I am therefore writing to inform the European Council that the United Kingdom is seeking a further extension. The UK proposes that this period should end on the 30th of June 2019. If the parties are able to ratify before this date, the government proposes that the period should be terminated early." Meanwhile, Mr Tusk could offer the UK a flexible Brexit extension of 1 year, according to a senior EU official. That plan is likely to be put to EU leaders at next week's EU summit. Meanwhile, the Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox, has said there's likely to be a lengthy Brexit delay if talks between the government and Labour don't succeed. Well, we'll go to Westminster to speak to our political correspondent Alex Forsyth about that letter shortly. But first, let's go to Brussels and speak to our correspondent Adam Fleming. So that letter perhaps on Donald Tusk's desk as we speak, Adam. Meanwhile, he's proposing a flexible extension to Brexit. What does that mean exactly?
Well, in really simple terms, the idea that Donald Tusk is putting on the table is that Article 50, the Brexit process in the EU treaty, the date of that, which has already been moved from the 29th of March to the 12th of April, be moved to the end of March 2020. But there's a little spin on this, which is that it would be made very clear that if the UK Parliament managed to get the Brexit deal through, then the UK could leave on a date that was earlier than the end of March 2020. We had thought that might be the 22nd of May, but it now sounds like Theresa May is asking for it to be the 30th of June. Now, you're right, the email from Downing Street will have landed in Donald Tusk's inbox a couple of minutes ago. My first reaction to it was, well, the EU aren't going to go for this because they want a longer extension so that they've got a clear end point rather than having to constantly revisit the end of the Brexit process every couple of months. But I do wonder if actually what they'll just do is write this 30th of June date into their flexible Brexit extension, but then in the next paragraph say, and if that doesn't work, Brexit's extended till the end of March 2020. Also, all these things always come down to diaries. EU leaders do not want to keep coming back and forwards to Brussels looking for extensions to Brexit. Having said that, though, there is an EU summit, a normal one, scheduled for the 20th of June. So maybe they could potentially go for the idea of a short extension to the 30th of June, but revisiting that and working out whether it's going to be possible when they come back to Brussels on the 20th of June.
So both the UK's proposal and the EU's proposal could be compatible, as you're explaining, Adam. Just glancing through this letter as we speak, the UK seems to accept for the first time, and I'm reading a paragraph as I speak to you, that it may have to take part in the European Parliament elections. The relevant paragraph says, it remains the government's view that despite this request to extend Article 50 period, it's in the interests of neither the UK nor the EU that the UK holds elections to the European Parliament. However, the UK accepts the European Council's view that if the UK is still a member state of the European Union on the 23rd of May 2019, it would be under a legal obligation to hold the elections. Interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, that is the government formally for the first time saying that it accepts that it will have to hold the European Parliament elections if it stays in the EU beyond the date of those elections, which is the 23rd of May. To me, that is not a huge surprise because the government had already started laying the groundwork for those elections to take place. For example, David Lidington, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, the de facto Deputy Prime Minister, had written to the returning officers in the local authorities, the people that organise the polling stations in the primary schools and the leisure centres and get the ballot boxes ready, saying, if you incur expenses for the European Parliament elections and they do not end up happening, the government will reimburse you for the costs, which was everyone took that as an incredibly clear signal that the government was preparing the groundwork to hold those elections. And Theresa May's letter confirms that the government will actually table the official legal order in Parliament. A member of the cabinet a minister will have to do that in the next couple of days, which will be the official starting gun for the European Parliament elections taking place. Though the government will continue to insist they see a track by which the UK could be leaving by the 22nd of May, which means those elections won't have to take place. Think about it for a second, though. You could have a situation where you have leaflets, posters, party political broadcasts, postal votes, ballot papers, all ready, and then on the stroke of midnight on the 22nd of May, they all get ripped up because they weren't needed. I mean, people said the European Parliament elections would be quite a bizarre process if they took place in this context. That's a sign of just how it might feel.
Well, I don't think anyone would be surprised by what twist or turn this process could take next, Adam. Thank you very much for that. Adam Fleming in Brussels. Over now to Westminster, and our correspondent Alex Forsyth is there. Alex, reading through this letter, as we all are, just give us your initial thoughts, your initial assessment of what Theresa May has written.
Well, I don't think it is hugely different from what we would have expected her to have written, because the Prime Minister's already made clear that she was going to seek an extension to this process because Parliament and the Prime Minister have said they don't want the UK to leave without a deal, which is what would happen next Friday if there was not to be an extension. So no surprise there. What she's effectively saying is, I want an extension until June the 30th, but I still hope to be able to get a deal through before that. And if I can, and if we can leave before May the 23rd, then we won't have to take part in those European elections. That is something the Prime Minister absolutely does not want to do. She's consistently said it, and as Adam was alluding to, the feeling in government is that it would be really unpalatable to the public to be asked to vote in the European Parliament elections some 3 years after they said they wanted to leave the EU. So she's still trying to avoid that. What else is important in this letter is that she expresses, as you might expect her to, a sense of frustration at the fact there hasn't been a resolution to the Brexit process yet. She talks very much about the efforts that she is making to reach a consensus. So we know she is in discussion with the Labour Party to see if they can find a compromise that could be put to Parliament. And she says to the EU, if that doesn't happen, if those talks don't result in some firm outcome pretty soon, then she will do the idea of putting a whole series of options before Parliament to see if there is something that MPs can rally round. The whole tone of this letter is that she is trying to say to the EU, look, I'm on the verge of getting something through. We're working really hard to do that. I'm happy to compromise. I'm happy to build a consensus. Our focus is still on trying to get a deal before May the 22nd so we can leave before the elections. However, I acknowledge that if we can't do that, and we might not be able to, then we're going to have to stay in a bit longer until June the 30th, and we will have to take part in those elections.
And Alex, with Theresa May appearing to say that she'll agree to abide by the will of the House if Jeremy Corbyn and she come to an agreement, does that put more pressure on Labour in these talks that are continuing today?
Well, that is what she said in her statement that she made in Downing Street earlier this week when she set out her next steps. So, yeah, what she's effectively saying to Labour is, like, I'm asking you to help me get a Brexit deal through. And if we can't find a compromise, we have to go to Parliament to see if there's an option they can agree. But Jeremy Corbyn, you've got to back that. So, yeah, she's effectively setting Labour up to be able to say that if Labour opposes this or objects to it, the accusation from the government will be that Labour has prevented this process moving forward and that it's Labour's fault if we end up leaving without a deal or if Brexit is delayed for a much, much longer period. Now, of course, what Labour would say is that it's Theresa May's handling of negotiations up to this point which has brought us to where we are. You know, but I think it is worth noting that both sides saying very clearly that they're having these discussions to try and find a compromise in the most honest sense. They both say that they've been productive talks so far. They're meeting again today. They want to try and work a way through this, but the political differences are still pretty stark. And that is why Theresa May is having to acknowledge at this point that, having failed 3 times already to get her deal through Parliament, there is a possibility that compromise can't be found and the extension could be longer. We could be looking at those European Parliamentary elections.
And just a very quick thought, Alex, how do you think this idea of a more flexible extension as opposed to a fixed longer extension will go down with MPs?
Well, I mean, this is what Theresa May is asking for, and this is what Donald Tusk is apparently offering, although, of course, the extension length is the thing that's subject to debate. I think Downing Street will hope that this may focus some minds to get behind the Prime Minister's deal rather than risk a longer extension. But already some senior Brexiteers are suggesting they won't be pushed into backing the Prime Minister's Brexit deal if indeed that is the choice that's open to them. There's still a lot of anger here at the moment about the fact we are where we are in this process. A lot of people saying that they will not be forced or cajoled into backing a deal they don't agree with. So there's still a lot of uncertainty about whether, even if Labour and the Conservatives can agree something, MPs will rally round it.
OK, Alex, thank you very much for that. Alex Forsyth in Westminster.